How did EPA get to the absurd conclusion that 1.5 billion tons of carbon emissions aren't significant? We've got to do our duty as citizens, regardless of when it's tough or when it's easy. He's taught constitutional law as well as environmental law. He's written a host of books, 200 plus articles.
Sue them and then sue them again.
You're listening to A Climate Change. I'm your host, Matt Matern. I've got a great guest on the program, Professor Dan Farber from UC Berkeley Law School. He's taught constitutional law as well as environmental law. He's written a host of books, 200 plus articles, done a whole lot of work in this environmental space. I just was reading a series of articles, Dan, that you just read on Legal Planet regarding the emperor's new endangerment theory. How did EPA get to the absurd conclusion that 1.5 billion tons of carbon emissions aren't significant? Well, welcome to the program, Dan.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about your journey. I mean, you started off at University of Illinois undergrad and law school. I take it you're from the Chicago area. I'm a Chicagoan, so I have that kinship with you.
Yeah, great. Well, I did start out there. Then after I went back to the University of Illinois to teach after being a law clerk for Justice Stevens on the Supreme Court. And after a few years of that, I moved to the University of Minnesota, partly because I wanted a little more of a city to live in, and it's a very attractive place in a lot of different ways. And I was there for a long time before making the jump about 20 years ago out to Berkeley. And my interests have kind of evolved over that time too. I'm still quite involved with constitutional law and environmental law. Within those fields, I'm now a lot more interested in separation of powers in constitutional law, which is sort of a daily issue today. Given what the president's doing. And my environmental interests have really coalesced around climate change. So really, in some ways, doing the same thing, but in other ways, I've maybe sort of honed my focus. I also have a lot more of focus on trying to advance change rather than doing legal scholarship for its own sake. I started out being much more Ivy League. And for better or worse, as I've gotten older, I've felt more of a need to try to make a difference.
Yeah, well, I feel that as myself in terms of my lawyering career. We've done a lot of civil rights cases, helping employees who've been harassed and discriminated at work, and now we're taking on some environmental cases, and it feels good to be a part of that process and that fight. I guess I would ask you, in terms of there's so many things that the current administration is doing that are harmful to the long-term environment. Can you kind of rate them in terms of the parade of horrors that we're facing?
Well, that's kind of a challenge because they are doing so many different things. I think at the core of what they're doing in the environment is this sort of passionate, almost fanatic desire to expand fossil fuels. And at the same time to get rid of any environmental restrictions that could stand in the way. And I think that just shows up in climate policy. It shows up in NEPA with environmental impact statements. It even shows up with some water pollution issues. It's something you see in the reconciliation bill that, of course, from my point of view, that's profoundly misguided. And it's not always fun to get up in the morning and look at the latest news.
Yeah, it seems like it's just getting worse and worse. The changes to the alleged big, beautiful bill now are kind of punishing the wind and solar industry for, being too clean and too efficient, and kind of hurting them.
They've gotten more aggressive about phasing out tax credits and zeroing out funding under the Inflation Reduction Act. They've also imposed a sort of penalty tax in the latest version of the Senate bill that really does punish these sources for no reason except apparently that Republicans, as I said, prefer fossil fuels. I think it's even apart from climate change, all of this seems to be, completely destructive of whatever we do in our country. The rest of the world is moving very quickly to adopt new energy technologies like solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles. And we're just, trying to build a wall around ourselves and, stay in the 1950s, I guess.
Well, it kind of just doesn't make any sense in terms of just economics, and that wind and solar are cheaper than coal. So I can't imagine investors wanting to put money into a new coal plant, in part because they also realize that what Trump is doing is unlikely to hold for the long term. So they're going to get hit with regulations that are similar to what have existed in the last 50 years regarding emissions, right?
Yes, I think that's right. He can't really guarantee them permanent immunity from environmental laws. And he's doing a lot of other things, of course, that will make new investments a much dicier proposition in terms of what he's done with tariffs and, other sort of erratic economic policies. So it's unlikely that he's going to be prompting a return to clean, beautiful coal, as he likes to call it. And one thing that's really interesting is if you look at the oil industry, it hasn't done particularly well under Trump. I mean, it's surprising because, they're his cherished allies. But in fact, if you look at, revenues, if you look at share prices and so forth, they've been at best in the doldrums. And I think a big part of the reason is that they're exposed to all the uncertainty that he's imposing on the economy as a whole. They use a lot of steel, which he's subjected to tariff. I mean, when you look at what he's doing, it really doesn't make sense in terms of a coherent strategy, right? He's got like his environmental strategy, but it does, which, as I said, is to encourage certain industries, but then he's not really doing anything that would actually make it attractive for them to invest. And he wants to keep prices down, which also means that investment is not, more drilling, for example, is just not very economic. So, I mean, I guess there's that going for us in some sense, that despite all the harm he's doing, his ability to actually change what's going on in the real world is more limited.
Well, the incoherence of his policies just don't make for stability and achieving the results that he'd like to achieve. I mean, kind of on another front, deporting 10 million people is going to tank the economy. So if he was to actually do that, he's going to offset any other benefits that he might be doing by deregulating the economy in some way, shape, or form. So that's a loser economic proposition, if nothing else.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I don't know. I think on the one hand, I'm very depressed about what they're planning to do in the energy sector with this reconciliation bill. On the other hand, there's so many other immensely damaging provisions in the law that, this is only just one piece of, a law that's going to take away healthcare from 12 million people. It's, going to do bad things on immigration by pouring tons of money into ICE and detention centers. It's just sort of one thing after another. So anyway, I guess, as they say, we live in interesting times.
Yeah. Well, on the good news front, I saw recently that Ireland has become the sixth country that has gotten off of coal. So that seems to be the trend in the greater world, in the world around us, people are getting off of coal and trying to, use cleaner energy sources. What kind of effect do you think these countries that are operating in a cleaner space are going to have on the U.S. despite U.S. policies?
I think that these economic trends are inevitably going to affect the U.S. I mean, one reason why the oil industry isn't doing that great is that demand for oil on the consumer side globally is not really growing. There are various reasons for that, but one of them is that, greater fuel efficiency, more hybrids, more EVs are just sucking away a lot of the market. And that's going to continue. And, we can try to live in our own little heavily polluted, garrison here. But, inevitably, what's happening in these other countries is going to impact our economy and impact even our fossil fuel sector.
Right. As China pumps out more EV vehicles, and some of them are now at $10,000 a pop, and imports them or exports them around the world, that is going to drop demand for internal combustion engines, and more consumers are going to go electric, and that will decrease the demand for fossil fuels. We can only keep up the barriers so long before we have to deal with Chinese competition on these in the electric vehicle sector.
Yeah, one of my mantras right now, as I think about what this reconciliation bill is doing, I'm telling myself, have faith in the technology. These are better ways of generating and using energy for a whole bunch of reasons. Climate change is an important one, but reducing air pollution, even economics, the technologies are still improving. Particularly say batteries, which are just, seem to be developing longer charging times, quicker charging, lower costs, almost like on a weekly basis. And I think regardless of these efforts, eventually the U.S. is going to just have to face reality that, that the old ways are not the best ways.
Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk has turned on Trump, saying that this big, beautiful bill is kind of an abomination, and of course, he has some economic dog in the hunt. So, but I think from a technologist's point of view, and an engineer's point of view, you have to see the absolute stupidity of essentially ceding solar and battery and wind technology to the Chinese, which is clearly the wave of the future. And the United States is essentially saying, oh, let's just hide our head in the sand and pretend like these technologies don't exist.
Yeah, I know. And I feel like in the end, there's a logic to the development of the technologies that is going to have its way. And the U.S., we can hurt ourselves. We can handicap ourselves economically for competing in these industries. But in the long run, there are a lot of people in the world that love horses, but there aren't any countries that rely solely on buggies and carriages to get people around, right? Eventually, the new technology just becomes unavoidable.
So in the short term, and dealing with the situation with Trump, in your recent article about his changes at EPA and what EPA is doing to kind of bury its head in the sand, what do you think are the best ways of fighting that?
Well, the most obvious one and a really important one is litigation. The Trump administration, a lot of people thought after the first administration they had learned their lesson about the need to have careful lawyering, to dot all their I's, cross their T's, make sure they had all the technical stuff. And I thought that too, but it turns out no. that they are, sort of coming back and making even, bigger bets on sort of, in many ways, high risk legal strategies. And, I think they can be beaten in court. For example, you mentioned that I was talking about their endangerment finding, or rather insignificance finding on Legal Planet, where they really come to this completely bizarre conclusion. Even though the U.S. power sector standing up alone emits almost as much CO2 as the entire country of Russia, that somehow that's not significant. And they have a lot of detailed arguments for that, but they're really just, I don't think, going to hold up in court. So sue them and then sue them again, I think is got to be an important strategy.
Well, one of the things you point out is I think the U.S. power sector produces, what is it, 1.5 billion tons of emissions. And they're saying, well, that's not significant. It's just insanity. I guess my concern is, hey, this gets up to the Supreme Court, and is a politicized Supreme Court able to turn logic on its head? And do you see, 5 justices backing this really crazy position?
I think, well, a couple of things. First, the Supreme Court can't hear everything. And in fact, they're actually having full-scale review of cases where they, have briefs and oral argument and so on. That's becoming less frequent every year. So they've got a sort of limited number of cases they can actually decide on the merits. And Trump is doing so many things that there's just no way they can intervene in all of them. I don't think they can even do that at the sort of preliminary relief stage, on what's called the shadow docket. So I do think that's limited. I also think that at some point they're going to have to make a choice about whether they're going to put legal rules that they, in many cases, have specifically endorsed on the table, so Trump can, achieve policies that they may possibly like, or are they going to stick, with defending the legal rules, the precedents, in some cases their own past rulings. And I haven't given up on the idea that they are as conservative as they are, that Trump is pushing things to the point where they're just going to have trouble swallowing them. We'll see. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I do see some favorable signs in what they've done in at least a few of the cases that they've decided recently. So, so anyway, I think we've got to make that effort, even if we're worried about whether, in the end, the Supreme Court will pull out the rug, because it's too important and too promising as a response tactic to just give up on.
Definitely not giving up. What would your thought be in terms of positive signs that you've seen? I mean, certainly Trump hasn't won everything at the Supreme Court level, and a number of justices that he even appointed have ruled against him on various cases. So that's, I guess, some cause for hope. In particular, as to the environmental decisions, you wrote about in your article that it would be pretty difficult for any court to kind of disregard the 50 years of history since the Clean Air Act to kind of take on this new interpretation.
Yeah, I think that's going to be difficult. I think these are people who say that the most important thing in deciding a case is the language of the statute, and that doesn't support the Trump people in this case. And I think that even the Trump people are not sure that they're going to win, because they make other arguments too for rolling back the Biden rule. So obviously they're not putting all their chips on this one. I think the basic strategy of the Trump administration is to just sort of take an outrageous position and then just dare anybody to push back. And I think the more we push back, the more we undermine the credibility of that move. I think this is not a court that's, that's passionate about the environment, to say the least. I know, I think most of them are more or less indifferent. I think Justice Sotomayor is actually the most prominent, person on the other side. She seems to be somebody who does genuinely care about environmental issues. But I think they do care about the rule of law. And I think that they're going to find just a lot of cases where Trump is making things up that they're not going to be able to support. So anyway, I think that's like the most promising immediate response, at least, to try to block some of these things from going into effect where possible and ultimately overturn them in the courts. I also think right now our best prospect for making progress, not just fighting back against Trump, is going to be at the state level. The states have played a really important role in U.S. climate policy. There are now a bunch of states that have adopted net zero targets, either for their grids or for their entire economy. And so I think there's a reservoir of goodwill there. Some states have been more active than others in actually trying to implement those policies, but there's still a lot going on at the state level. And even if the sort of national politics right now are unfavorable, I think there are a lot of states that could make real progress toward cutting emissions.
Well, let's take, there's kind of two fronts that I'd like to talk about more. One is the state issue that you've just brought up, but also kind of dealing with the Trump administration on the issue you outlined in your Legal Planet article. And where would the first case be brought? Who should bring those cases? And should multiple cases be brought in order to effectuate a good strategy here?
The issue I was talking about with the endangerment finding and the rollback of the Biden administration rule, I think the cases will have to be brought in the D.C. Circuit because of the way the Clean Air Act is structured. So I think there's like not really potential for, looking for a favorable judge in San Francisco or Rhode Island and going after them. The law about that is, not 100% crystal clear. So it's possible that somebody might be able to manage something there, but I don't think so. So I think the case is going to have to be in the D.C. Circuit. And if there are multiple cases, the D.C. Circuit will just roll them all together and hear them as one. I think clearly, environmental groups can be involved. I think state governments like California in particular, because we have a special interest in trying to pursue our own policies and not have as much support as we can get from federal regulation, but not just, I think there'll be a bunch of states that might be involved. And the sort of standard environmental groups. I think the big issue in some of these cases is going to be to try to figure out how to sort of run these cases as cost effectively as possible, so people are not tripping over each other, or there's so many things to sue Trump about. You have to try to spend the money as wisely as you can in each individual case. But I don't think there'll be any shortage of potential plaintiffs. I'd like to see Tesla come in, or some other tech companies to pursue their interests in clean energy. Tesla does a lot of energy storage, for example, that could be affected by what the government does about power plants. So anyway, I don't think there's any shortage of people to bring the lawsuits. I think, if anything, the problem is just sort of making sure that they don't trample each other in the rush.
Well, allegedly, I read that Musk is going to try to oppose Trump in every way possible, but I'll believe it when I see it. I guess another thing that you mentioned on the state level, California has moved to phase out internal combustion engines in regular consumer vehicles, cars, and the EPA and Trump are pushing back on that. Where do you see that going, and how effective do you think California can be in fighting Trump on that one and the EPA?
Well, I think the biggest problem at the moment is the Congress using the regulatory review law actually overturned the EPA. This is kind of complicated. California, in order to do these things, has to get a waiver from EPA, and Congress overturned the waiver. And that has at least some effect on California's ability to go forward with similar regulations in the future, depending on how similar they are. So I think right now, I don't see California trying to come forward with new regulations when they have the same Republican Congress sitting there. But I think down the road at some point, California certainly will. And in the meantime, California is looking at other ways to start moving away from internal combustion engines and toward electric vehicles. And, there are various things that have been talked about. I don't know what decisions have been made about which way to go. One thing California can probably do is require that state and local governments buy only EVs. That's probably not covered by any of these other, sort of roadblocks. And that's one thing. There's been talk about financial incentives, although the budget is pretty tight right now. I think there are going to be not one single solution, because the Republicans have made it hard to use the sort of most direct route to getting there. But I certainly don't think California is going to be giving up on trying to clean up its, the car fleet. It's the number one source of carbon in California. It's the number one source of air pollution. So it's just imperative for us to sort of put on our thinking caps and figure out a way to move forward. It's much easier in many ways for states to address the industry and the electric power sector. They're just sort of special regulatory obstacles when you're talking about vehicle regulation that don't exist for these other sources. So I think, we're also going to see states doubling down on that. Maybe more. I'm hoping that Washington State and California will link their emissions trade, cap and trade programs, emission trading programs, because that would allow them to reduce their costs. It would be great if other states were interested in joining in. Again, not because it's necessarily the ideal way, but because we know how to do it. And it also provides an easy way for states to kind of stand together on these issues. But, there are other tools you can use besides that one for sure. And I think what states do in that area will certainly be subject to challenge. But I don't think those challenges are going to be successful. I think the basic ground rules really favor states in regulating in that area.
So have you been involved in advising the state of California at all, or any other states, as far as creating regulations in this area?
I haven't been involved directly in that, although I know some people who are. Sort of more broadly, our Environmental Law Center at Berkeley works closely with the state on lots of different policy issues, including electric vehicle charging and other transportation-related issues like public transit. I think that there's there's a lot of room in these areas, to try to figure out better ways of getting people out of cars onto transit, to figure out how we can improve housing patterns so people are not having to drive ridiculous distances. I think affordable housing is really a climate issue, because to get someplace they can afford now, people are buying, 2 hours away from the city, and then commuting these ridiculous distances and burning up a bunch of gasoline. So I think these problems don't have just one answer. And if if one of the levers isn't working right now, there are other levers we can pull to try to reduce emissions from transportation or, from industry, from the power sector.
So you referenced the electric power regulation in the states and the state's ability to regulate that in a positive way for the environment. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you're thinking there.
States have a couple of sort of powers. In the first place, the Clean Air Act, which sets minimum standards for state regulators, but it explicitly allows them to impose stricter standards than federal law requires. And at the same time, the Federal Power Act, which kind of regulates the grid, makes it clear that it's up to states to regulate power generators, not the federal government. And that, again, kind of, clears space for states to pursue their own energy policies. I mean, you can tell this is driving Trump crazy because he's issued, executive orders, bad, kind of insulting state clean energy policies and saying they're dangerous to the country and so forth. I think that's a sign of frustration. He knows he doesn't like it, but they haven't really figured out a way that they can seriously limit. I mean, they can do some things of one kind or another, but, I think in the end, the federal powers just are not as strong in this area as they are, say, with regulating the national vehicle fleet. And so I think states have real possibilities to do things on the regulatory side and maybe do some creative things too. We know, one of the things that struck me so much over the years that I've been watching climate policy is the way we run it. Everyone thinks we're going to succeed going down one road, and then suddenly there's this huge roadblock and we can't do that. And then people have just been very creative and smart about finding other ways each time that's happened. I mean, we thought we were going to get a national climate law in 2010. That never happened, and the politics shifted away. And, we didn't just give up and, wait for better times. People started thinking about lots of other ways of getting the job done, including state regulation, including EPA regulations, including working with corporations that want to become more sustainable. So I'm always impressed because a lot of these are not ideas I would have thought of. But, there are just a lot of smart people trying to figure out, how we're going to try to save the planet. And I think that's in some ways our greatest resource.
Well, that's good to hear. And that's kind of what I've found in doing this podcast, is very impressed by the literally millions of people around the world that are working on climate and doing incredible work that is making a difference. So, I guess my concern is it possible for the Trump administration and the Congress to overturn those laws that allow the states to have stricter standards? Is that possible for them to do, or is that unlikely because of other reasons?
Well, I think it's not really possible for Trump to do it because these are, written into statute. Now, Congress could theoretically pass laws that take away these powers, but at least first they have to do it while they control both houses of Congress, which may not last past the midterms. And second, they would pretty much have to get rid of the Senate filibuster in order for that to work. And so far, the Senate just does not seem to be willing to do that. And Thune has come up with some workarounds so he can, he can say that he's respecting the filibuster, and the Senate parliamentarian who's kind of the gatekeeper and guardian of these rules. But he's clearly not willing to just have a vote and eliminate the filibuster. And as long as that's there, I think it's unlikely that they can pass anything. And we're also seeing that even on something, all Republicans love tax cuts. That may be the single thing that they most deeply embrace, at least as a political matter. And yet, even when the stakes are really high in terms of preserving existing tax cuts and adding to them. The Republicans have had a terrible time actually getting to an agreement on what to do. And these other issues, they don't have the same kind of urgency for Republicans, I don't think. And so I think it'd be correspondingly harder for Trump or the congressional leadership to actually get Congress to agree on a specific piece of legislation and pass it. Yeah, it's possible. Anything's possible. We've sort of seen that, but I think it's very unlikely.
Well, that's good to hear. There have been some threats. Trump doesn't like the Senate parliamentarian who ruled against the Republican interests on a few occasions. Is there real risk to that position going to some partisan who, kind of ignores precedent and allows things to be put into a budget reconciliation bill that really should require or should be, subject to a filibuster?
As I say, anything's possible, but I think Republican senators realize that if they want to keep the filibuster, it needs to have some kind of independent guardian. And if they eliminate that, that's just an invitation for the Democrats to do the same whenever the Democrats retake the Senate. Occasionally, for example, they fired the head of the Congressional Budget Office some years ago because they didn't like the way the Budget Office was, figuring out the budget implications of various bills. But in the long run, that hasn't really made the office partisan because, again, they really need to have some kind of credible assessment as the basis for what they're doing. And enough of them, I think, care about, how much money we are spending and what are the budgetary implications and so forth, that they're not willing to get rid of that. And so even if Trump put so much pressure on Thune that Thune got rid of the current parliamentarian, which I think he's unlikely to do, but I'm not sure that, I don't think the replacement would just be a partisan hack. I hope I'm not being too optimistic.
No, I think you make a good argument of why that isn't going to be the case. And, the Republicans' Senate majority is not that wide that they can be assured that they won't lose it in the next election and then be subject to Democrats having complete control and them having no ability to stop the Democrats from doing whatever they want. So I think there is some institutional memory there that is a little less short-sighted than Trump, who generally can't see more than 24 hours past whatever the news cycle is. Kind of getting back to something that you talked about earlier, which is the cap and trade and Washington and California linking together on that. How do you see the policy working currently as to whether or not California's cap and trade policy is working effectively and making a difference? And is it possible or for, say, the 17, I think, or 22 states that have Democratic majorities working together on that front and being even more effective? Because my understanding is that, 60% of the GNP is generated by democratically controlled states.
Yeah, I think the California policy has been working. It's a little hard to assess because California is doing so many other things in the climate space at the same time, and you don't always know what policy is, causing what result. But I think it's been effective during the time that it's been in place. California has cut its emissions dramatically. I think the cap and trade will be more important even in the next round of emissions reductions, or between post 2030 that we're going to have to be worrying about pretty soon. I also think that there's some real potential for states to work together. Now, there's the state people who work on climate issues are talking to each other anyway. It's not like anybody's in a vacuum. But this is a way that they, potentially could really bring down the costs of emission cuts, which I think is going to be really important. I think everybody's worried about affordability right now. Everybody's worried about electricity prices. California is pretty expensive for electricity. So anything we can do to not only achieve our cuts, but to do it in the cheapest ways that we can, I think is going to be politically appealing. And by the way, the predictions are that the reconciliation bill will raise electric power bills across the country by, 15, 20% ultimately, because of the fact that you're getting rid of the cheapest forms of energy available and trying to replace them with more expensive ones.
Well, yeah, the stupidity of those plans are just beyond belief from a party that says that it's for kind of business interests and common sense and all of that. This is lacking in any kind of common sense and just is anti-business in so many ways. The whole AI industry and data centers are all needing cheaper power, and this is going to make power more expensive. Are those tech companies likely to kind of take matters into their own hands? And, Apple and some of these other behemoths, taking power generation and creating their own solar farms and wind farms?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, one of the things that's been interesting is the way these companies have pressured state regulators, particularly in red states, to give them access to renewables. And so I don't think that's necessarily going away. They may not be as loud about it given the political climate, but ultimately, they're partly doing this because they want to be seen as, on the right side on these issues. But I think in the long run, money's a more powerful motivator. And I think they realize that this is the low cost way. It gets them away from being reliant on prices for fossil fuels, which, can gyrate unexpectedly, whereas the price of sunshine is the same every single day. And, that's a kind of economic certainty that's also valuable to them.
Let me just ask you in closing to tell us about some of your heroes and also maybe some of the ways that you think people can get involved and can have an impact going forward and maybe support some of the work that you're doing and follow the work that you're doing online and read some of the articles that you're writing and stuff.
Okay, well, let me start with the last point, which is the easiest to answer. I blog a couple times a week on a website called Legal Planet that you mentioned earlier, legal-planet.org, that Berkeley Law School and UCL Law School do together on environmental issues from like the local level to the global level. I think a lot of my heroes are unsung because, as we were saying before, there are so many people doing great work. I mean, from the people who, the sort of brilliant engineers who are trying to figure out better ways to do batteries and more efficient solar panels and, all that stuff, to neighborhood activists who are, working with their neighbors to get their town or city to adopt more sustainable policies. And, or of those people, we have a natural tendency to focus on the big names, the people who get all the clicks or get in, I was going to say get in the headlines, but I want it to be a little, more in the moment. We focus on those people, but, they're really only the tip of the iceberg. And, so it's not the famous names, I think, who in the end are responsible for getting us to the point where we've, gotten now and who are going to move us forward. It's, there's thousands or tens of thousands of people who are just day and night trying to figure out how we're going to address the climate crisis.
Yeah, well, I definitely think that's true, and certainly appreciate you coming on the program to talk about these issues and spread the word of what's happening and how people can get involved, and even call your congressperson, even if they may not listen to you. Let your voice be heard. I know Bill McKibben was writing that in a blog post the other day, and we've got to do our duty as citizens, regardless of when it's tough or when it's easy. There's a duty to be done, and we need to kind of step up into the moment to do our duty.
Couldn't have said that better.
Well, thank you again, Dan. Appreciate all the amazing work that you've done over your career, and look forward to following your blog there at Legal Planet, and maybe collaborating as we go forward to spread the message, to continue to do this work that is so vital for all of humanity.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me on the podcast.
Thank you.
To learn more about our work at A Climate Change and how you can help us reach our goal of planting 30,000 trees in the Amazon this year, visit aclimatechange.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. See you next time.